with you about typical equity work. You may have noticed that, over the past, at this point, 4 years, let's round up, 5 years, equity has been on trend. Similar to how diversity was on trend in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it just became sort of an empty, meaningless sort of term that people just like sort of recklessly threw around. Yeah, some version of the same with equity. Over these past 5 years, equity, I see it here, there, and everywhere. So here's how equity work typically happens. A well-meaning campus leader, the president, the provost, or a VP, will commission an equity task force or an equity work group comprised of usually employees. Sometimes they're student representatives. But one of the things that almost always happens unintentionally in these equity work groups is that they attempt to do their equity work with no data on campus racial climate. Look, those very smart, very responsible citizens of our institutional communities do come to the table with some data, right? Usually they rely on data reports from the Office of Institutional Research that give us some sense of, racial disparities in, say, first to second year persistence, or in student academic performance, or, student attrition and departure from particular majors, certainly in graduation rates. Those are the data that the well-intended equity task force almost always uses to guide its work. I'm not suggesting at all that we ought to discontinue our reliance on those data. It's really important. Those are important, reliable data sources. What I am saying, though, is that we are going to arrive at an incomplete analysis of the root causes of those disparities that we see in those particular data if we don't also have data that tell us the truth about how students and/or employees are experiencing the racial climate. You see, you can't solve racial disparities without understanding the experiential realities that people are having and how those realities might differ across racial and ethnic groups. But yeah, that's what people usually do. They just like rely on the one set of data without assessing the climate. Look, let me give you another. There is often an inattention to the reparation of historical negligence, inequity, and harm. In other words, the task force that was commissioned for the 2020-2021 academic school year is attempting to solve 2020-2021 problems without also understanding how some of these problems date back to 1961, 71, 81, 91, 2001, 2011, right? In other words, what I'm saying here is that we cannot solve today's problems with also taking stock of the years, in some instances, the decades or even the generations of negligence and harm that has been inflicted on particular racial and ethnic groups at our institutions. But again, the well-intended equity task force, is trying to work on 2020 problems, 2021 problems. Okay, let me give you a couple more. This one is, it emerges from our observations. It in fact emerges from an inquiry activity of the center. So on several occasions, we've had the good fortune of spending an entire year with an equity task force at a college or university. Usually these kinds of task forces and committees, meet for an hour or 2 hours, rather, 2 hours, once a month over the course of a 9-month academic school year. So let's do quick math. That's 18 hours over an academic school year, right? So we would go as observers of their monthly task force meetings, and we'd sit in a corner and just observe each month and take field notes. It might surprise you that in the August meeting, nobody said a word about race or racism or anything racial. Maybe that doesn't surprise you. Maybe you're like me. You're like, it's August. Everybody's just reminding themselves of the charge from the president or the chancellor, and they are introducing themselves and getting to know each other. Okay, fine. But they're going to get to the race stuff in September, right? No. October? Mm-mm. No. February? Nope. We've gotten to May. 18 hours later, the well-intended equity task force members have met for 18 hours over a 9-month span and said not a word about race. They've talked around race and they talked about diversity and about equity and inclusion, but nobody said a word about race. The meetings are completely raceless, right? Okay, well then it ought not surprise you. Spoiler alert, the Equity Task Force produces its long-awaited equity report that the president or whomever commissioned, and yeah, it too is raceless. All right, look, here's the thing that we would do. It's kind of weirdly a fun thing for me. Even though I don't like the outcome, I do enjoy the task. I take a PDF of an equity task force report and I do a control F. And in the upper right-hand corner in the window, I would do a search for race, racial, racist, racism, Black, African American, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Chicano, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, so on and so forth, right? Search almost always returns no results. In the equity report, no results. Certainly not in the R words, race, racism, racial, those. No results. Where we do tend to see the names of the specific racial and ethnic groups is in the data tables. The data tables that are peppered throughout the report or are attached as appendices at the end. And those data tables very clearly show us disparities between students or between employees from different racial and ethnic groups when those data are disaggregated and presented in the data tables. You see, it could be that the data tables tell us specifically that on this one particular student outcome, that it is Pacific Islander students whom we are most underserving. It's very clear in the chart or the table. But yet, the actual narrative of the report says nothing at all about Pacific Islander students. In fact, even when we get to the recommendation section of the report, and there is a recommendation about how to improve student success on this particular outcome, there's just like this broad, all lives matter, very generic recommendation about how to do that. But yo, like the table said, the Pacific Islanders whom were most under, well, why is this all lives matter recommendation not more targeted at actually correcting the institutional disservice to this particular student group? All right, look, I want to make sure we end on time because there's going to be a great Q&A period. Please, if you haven't yet submitted your questions, please do that, I think in the chat or however you were instructed to do it. I forgot what they told you at the beginning, but there will be a Q&A, so let me hurry. There are just a few more things I want to lift up. The emphasis in the equity report, by the way, is almost entirely on deficits. What's wrong with these students, what students are or aren't doing, without also understanding that, the institution plays a serious role in the manufacturing of these disparate outcomes, right? And that we very rarely ask questions about, well, what are faculty members doing? Are they doing what the books say that they should do as it pertains to decolonizing the curriculum, making the classroom more inclusive? Making good use of racial tension when it arises. We don't tend to ask those kinds of questions. The questions are almost always about what's wrong with these people of color, right? That's a very racist, one-sided mishandling of our equity analyses. Look, two more. I'll be darned. There's too little emphasis in equity work not just in the task force, not just in the task force report, but broadly across the campus, too little emphasis on dismantling classroom racism. I am a student affairs professional at heart. I always will be. I got my start in student affairs. I love student affairs. But I'm also a faculty member. For 18 years now, I've been a faculty member. And I also understand that I don't care how good your student affairs or campus life division is, until and unless we do something about the racial harm that is done in classrooms, we are going to be woefully incomplete on our pursuit of equity. The one place that every student has to go is class. It's the one place, right? But yet, so little of the equity conversation on most campuses is about the racial violence that happens in the curriculum, or the racial exclusion, or the erasure of Asian American and Pacific Islander and Indigenous persons and multiracial persons in the curriculum. Here's the last one. I don't mean to offend anybody here. I'm not an offensive person. At least I don't like to think of myself as one. There's no remediation of racial illiteracy among faculty, staff, and administrators, including those on the equity task force. When I say remediation, when I was talking earlier about our campus climate work, and I said to you that most graduating seniors who are white, tell us in the interviews, and they continue to tell us in the quantitative surveys that, yeah, I didn't really learn nothing about race. And I feel totally unprepared to, transition from college into a racially diverse workplace or democracy or whatever. Well, those college seniors eventually become graduate students, some of them. Those graduate students, some of them become faculty members and staff members and administrators at Lehman College, at USC, where I work, and at other places. And they didn't learn anywhere in graduate school about these things either. So they show up at the campus not really knowing what to do about race, how to talk about it, because they never learned it anywhere. I want to just punctuate here, including those on the equity task force. The people who often get appointed to the equity task force, like low-key, some of them are like token appointees, right? Like the person commissioning the group is like, I need one Black woman. I need one Latina. I need one non-binary person, right? Like there's just this sort of Noah's Ark approach, honestly, to comprising the group. But just because those persons have those identities and those lived experiences, or because there is a really good white ally who has amassed a reputation for being a good white ally, that doesn't mean that those persons necessarily are experts on racial problem solving and on how to do racial equity.